Okay, I'm in London, and we're going to read the next part of Chapter 8 in Primitive Mythology called the Paleolithic Caves. We're still in Section 1 called The Shamans of the Great Hunt. Onward. Let us enter the great system of initiatory passages and chambers discovered a few days before the outbreak of the First World War, 60 feet below the surface soil of the property of Count Henri Beguin and his 3 sons at Montesquieu Avantes in the Pyrenees. The Count has named the labyrinth Trois Frères, 3 brothers, in honor of his boys who found it. The corridors, drops, ascents, and vast halls contain some 400 or 500 rock paintings and engravings, reproductions of many of which have not yet been published, but the patient work year after year of the Abbé Brieux, tracing, deciphering, and disentangling the figures, interpreting the and photographing them, has already brought forth such a gallery that we might think of this cave as the richest single treasury of clues to the ritual experience and mythological lore of the late Paleolithic period yet broached. It is cut off by a fall of rock underground from the adjoining grotto of Tuc de Dorbert, whose sanctuary of the bull and cow of the buffalo dance we have already described. Tuc de Dorbert, the Count and his sons had discovered only 2 years before they entered the Alice's wonderland of Trois Frères. And these 2 underground systems together, comprising at least a mile of labyrinthine ways, must have constituted, in the very long period of their use, one of the most important centers of magic and religion, if not indeed the greatest, in the world. The period of their use, by the way, was at least some 20,000 years. The Count and his sons, on July 20th, 1914, were on their way across a broad meadow to pay a visit to the cave that they had discovered 2 years before, when they sought the shade of a tree to rest from the heat. And a passing peasant, noticing their distress, suggested that they should go to Trois Souffleurs, where a cool wind came out of the ground even on the hottest day. With caves in mind, they followed his direction and found the blowhole behind a clump of bushes. The boys enlarged it, and one descended, tied to a rope that they had brought for their other adventure. Down he went. Some 60 feet were paid out before he stopped. He had brought a ball of twine, which he let out behind him, like Theseus in the labyrinth of the Minotaur, and a miner's lamp to illuminate the corridors, which had not been entered for more than 10,000 years. His father and 2 brothers, waiting, became nervous when he had been gone for over an hour, but then there was a tug at the rope and they hauled him up, bursting with excitement. A completely new cave with hundreds of pictures, he told them. However, the war came within a month, and it was not until 1918 that the exploration of the cave could be completed and the Abbé Brieux invited to commence his study. The ground is damp and slimy, wrote Dr. Herbert Kuhn, describing his visit to the cave in the summer of 1926. We have to be very careful not to slip off the rocky way. It goes up and down, and then comes a very narrow passage about 10 yards long, which you have to creep on all 4s. And then again there come great halls and more narrow passages. In one large gallery are a lot of red and black dots, just these dots. How magnificent the stalactites are. The soft drop of the water can be heard, dripping from the ceiling. There is no other sound and nothing moves. The silence is eerie. The gallery is large and long, and then there comes a very low tunnel. We placed our lamp on the ground and pushed it into the hole. Louis, the Count's eldest son, went ahead, then Professor van Giffen of Groningen, Holland, next Rita, Mrs. Kuhn, and finally myself. The tunnel is not much broader than my shoulders, nor higher. I can hear the others before me groaning, and see how very slowly their lamps push on. With our arms pressed close to our sides, we wriggle forward on our stomachs like snakes. The passage in places is hardly a foot high, so you have to lay your face right on the earth. I felt as though I were creeping through a coffin. You cannot lift your head, you cannot breathe, and then finally the burrow becomes slightly higher. One can at least rest on one's forearms, but not for long. The way again grows narrow, and so yard by yard one struggles on, some 40-odd yards in all. Nobody talks. The lamps are inched along, and we push after. I hear the others groaning. My own heart is pounding, and it is difficult to breathe. It is terrible to have the roof so close to one's head, and it is very hard. I bump it time and again. Will this thing never end? Then suddenly we are through, and everybody breathes. It is like a redemption. The hall in which we are now standing is gigantic. We let the light of the lamps run along the ceiling and walls, a majestic room, and there finally are the pictures. From top to bottom, a whole wall is covered with engravings. The surface had been worked with tools of stone, and there we see marshaled the beasts that lived at the time in southern France. The mammoth, rhinoceros, bison, wild horse, bear, wild ass, reindeer, wolverine, muskox. Also the smaller animals appear, snowy owls, hares, and fish. And one sees darts everywhere, flying at the game. Several pictures of bears attract us in particular, for they have holes where the images were struck and blood is shown spouting from their mouths. Truly a picture of the hunt, the picture of the magic of the hunt. The Abbé Breuil has published a beautiful series of tracings and photographs from this important sanctuary. The style is everywhere firm and full of life, with a spirit, as Professor Kuhn has remarked, comparable to the best Impressionist sketches. Actually, and most amazingly, and of course, this was one of the features that made the discovery of this art so momentous, they seem very much closer to us than the hieratic, stiffly stylized masterworks of archaic Egypt and Mesopotamia, which are so much closer to us in time. In this awesome subterranean chamber of Trois Frères, the beasts are not painted on the walls but engraved, fixing for millenniums the momentary turns, leaps, and flashes of the animal kingdom in a teeming tumult of external life. And above them all, predominant at the far end of the sanctuary, some 15 feet above the level of the floor, in a craggy, rocky apse, peering at the visitor with penetrating eyes, is the now famous Sorcerer of Trois Frères. Here is a picture of the sorcerer. Presiding impressively over the animals collected there in incredible numbers, he is poised in profile in a dancing movement that is similar, as the Abbé Breuil has suggested, to a step in the cakewalk. But the antlered head is turned to face the room. The pricked ears are those of a stag. The round eyes suggest an owl. The full beard descending to the deep animal chest is that of a man, as are likewise the dancing legs. The apparition has the bushy tail of a wolf or wild horse, and the position of the prominent sexual organ placed beneath the tail is that of the feline species, perhaps a lion. The hands are the paws of a bear. The figure is 2.5 feet high, 15 inches across. An eerie, thrilling picture, wrote Professor Kuhn. Moreover, it is the only picture in the whole sanctuary bearing paint, black paint, which gives it an accent stronger than all the rest. But who or what is this man, if man he is, whose image is now impressed upon us in a way that we shall not forget? The Count and the Abbé first supposed it to represent a sorcerer, but the Abbé now believes it to be the presiding god or spirit controlling the hunting expeditions and the multiplication of game. Professor Kuhn suggests the artist-magician himself. To the anthropologically practiced eye of Professor Carlton S. Kuhn of the University of Pennsylvania, on the other hand, this is just a man ready to hunt deer. Perhaps he is practicing. Perhaps he is trying to induce the spirit of the forest that controls the deer to make a fat buck walk his way. And Professor Kuhn concludes, whatever the artist's overt motive in painting it, he did it because he felt a creative urge and liked to express himself, as every artist does, whether he is painting a bison on the wall of a cave or a mural in the main hall of a bank. There must be some scientific way of supporting the romantic hypothesis of a man crawling on his belly through a tube 40 or 50 yards long to relieve a creative urge. Otherwise, I am sure the professor would not have made this suggestion. But for myself, I prefer the simpler course of assuming that this chamber and the whole cave was an important center of hunting magic, that these pictures served a magical purpose, that the people in charge here must have been high-ranking, highly skilled magicians, powerful by repute at least, if not in actual fact, and that whatever was done in this cave had as little to do with an urge to self-expression as the activity of the Pope in Rome celebrating a pontifical mass. Between the two guesses of the Abbé, however, it is extremely difficult to decide, but perhaps not as important to make a choice as a modern man might suppose. For if the vivid, unforgettable Lord of the Animals in the hunter's sanctuary of Trois Frères is a god, then he is certainly a god of sorcerers. And if a sorcerer, he is one who has donned the costume of a god. And as we know, and see amply illustrated in the ritual lore of modern savages, when the sacred regalia has been assumed, the individual has become an epiphany of the divine being itself. He is taboo. He is a conduit of divine power. He does not merely represent the god. He is the god. He is a manifestation of the god, not a representation. But a picture, too, is such a manifestation, and so perhaps the most likely interpretation is, after all, the second by the Abbé, namely, that the so-called sorcerer of Trois Frères is actually a god, the manifestation of a god, who, indeed, may also have been embodied in some of the shamans themselves during the course of the rites, but here is embodied for us forever in this wonderful icon. First among the features of the great caves that are of paramount importance to our study is the fact that these deep, labyrinthine grottos were not dwellings, but sanctuaries, comparable in function to the men's dancing grounds of the Aranda. And there is evidence enough to assure us that they were used for similar purposes. The boy's puberty rites and the magical increase of the game. And just as every shrine and ceremony in the ancient world, as well as among the primitive tribes whose customs we know, had its origin legend, so must sanctuaries of the old Stone Age have had theirs. The enigmatic figures painted into the crypts and deepest recesses of the caves almost certainly hold in their silence the myths of the ultimate source of the magical efficacy of these magnificent shrines. The dwellings of the people, on the other hand, were either in shallow caves and under ledges, or out on the open plains in various kinds of shelter. A number of the paintings suggest the forms of their shacks or houses, while under many ledges abundant remains have been found of old Stone Age life. In fact, the beautiful valleys of the Dordogne people are dwelling under those same ledges to this day. They are great ledges, left by the wash of mighty glacial rivers, and the same rivers now being much smaller and lower than they were, they have left a beautiful grassy area between their present banks and the tall cliffs into which the ledges curve. One has to climb a little to reach the comfortable French homes that nestle against the overhanging walls. And just beneath the earth of these modern homes there is to be found a stratum of Gallo-Roman remains from the period of Vercingetorix and Julius Caesar. Below that, remains of the earlier Gallic culture world. Still lower, the Neolithic of circa 2500 to 1000 BC, and then the Paleolithic, level after level, Azilian, Magdalenian, Solutrean, Aurignacian, even Mousterian, some 50,000 years of human living in one amazing cross-sectional view. On the topmost level you may find a broken bicycle chain, on the bottom a cave bear tooth 2 inches long. And the concierge who is showing you the cut is herself living in a house with the solid rock of the cliff for its back wall. And she will tell you what the advantages are of a building with such a wall. It is cool in summer and warm in winter. The rock, sheer mother rock, affords good protection. Meanwhile, out in front, there is to be seen the graceful sweep of grass down to the lovely river, and one cannot but recognize and feel that for millenniums this has been a fine place for the raising of children. Paleolithic men hunted for their food instead of growing it, and they walked or ran from place to place instead of bicycling or riding in a car. But otherwise, they had their youngsters and their wives sewed clothes, not of cloth but of leather. The men had their workshops for the chipping of flint and their men's clubs in their secret caves. They were living in the main just about as people do now, and so it has been for some 50,000 years. The tick of time in such a situation does not sound quite as loudly as it once did. We'll stop there now. Thanks for joining me, and we'll pick up with section 2 next time.